What's up, guys, and welcome to this video. So today we're going to talk about the Nerdio for Azure Cost Estimator. And I know for most people, especially if you're new to Azure, it can be a little bit smoke and mirrors trying to anticipate what your Azure spend will be on a month-to-month basis. And this can be especially challenging if you're trying to put together a new quote or proposal. So that's kind of where our Nerdio for Azure Cost Estimator comes in. This tool basically will allow you to compile all your expenses in one coherent report that includes things like Office, licensing, virtual machine month to month, whether you're going to do reserved instance or Azure hybrid usage, and then also the Nerdio cost that's going to be associated with the user count. So what we're going to do, guys, is in this video, we will walk through the NFA cost estimator pretty much line by line, and I'm going to explain each section in detail. And after this video, you should feel pretty empowered to quote just about any opportunity totally on your own. All right, so with that, let's get started. All right, so there are two different ways of locating the Nerdio for Azure Cost Estimator. If you are already a signed partner or a trial partner, you should have a Nerdio admin portal login. What you'll do, you'll just log into the Nerdio admin portal. You should see something like this page right here, and it'll just show all the different accounts you have. If you've got a trial account, it'll probably just show this default WinHeart, but this would just be the general accounts page. What you do is you go to Billing, then Nerdio for Azure Cost Estimator, and that will bring you to our cost estimator page. Now, if you have not signed up for Nerdio yet and you do not have a trial account, you can just go to getnerdio.com, and then what you'll do is you'll select this Azure Cost Estimator, and it'll provide the option for you there as well. So as you can see here, we have three primary SKUs that you can deploy with using Nerdio. So starting on the left here, we have our core. This is just infrastructure focused. So what that means is if you have a client who says, hey, we like the idea of virtual desktops for our users, however, we're really not ready to go that route, you can actually deploy with core. It'll just provide the infrastructure, file server, domain controller, line of business servers, backups, networking, all that good stuff is provided in core, but the user side of things from a virtual desktop, you can still do some basic user management like resetting passwords and assigning licensing, Office licensing to users. However, the Windows virtual desktop side of things is removed from core, and this is billed on a flat rate, $59 per client account per month. Professional here is used very rarely. There's some very fringe cases that it's applied, so I won't really get into that. What I'm going to focus on for the sake of the demo today is enterprise. Enterprise is full infrastructure, full user-facing resources, full networking, backups. It has everything included. It's billed at a rate of $12 per desktop user per month. What that means is you might have 200 users in your environment, but if only 10 of those are assigned a pooled or a dedicated desktop, you would only be billed for those 10 users. So something to keep in mind is that the core and professional SKUs just remove features that are available in enterprise. So going through this deployment based on the enterprise SKU provides you kind of a full look at all of the options that Nerdio provides. So what we'll do now that we've selected our enterprise SKU is scroll down here and let's start getting into the user face side of things. So section 2 here, this is where we specify the user facing resources. So first question, number of users in this environment. So we're going to say, for the sake of this deployment, let's say there are 25 users, the size of a pretty standard environment. The next question here, are we going to be deploying a Windows virtual desktop or an RDS environment? The vast majority of deployments that we've seen, especially since WVD came out, is WVD focused. So that's what I will really hone in on for this demo here. There are two fringe cases I've seen RDS applied effectively. Those tend to be when there's some type of internal line of business application that was developed for the RDS environment, and it would take too much to actually move that for WVD to make it WVD compatible. So very, very rare, but there have been situations where we've seen that, and in that case, deploying an RDS environment is appropriate. The other scenario is when the MSP just says, you know what, we're really more comfortable with the RDS environment. WVD sounds good, but we need to get a new deployment up and running, and we're just going to go RDS because it's what we know, and we'll switch to WVD down the road. And Nerdio does provide some migration options to get the environment from RDS to WVD. So again, I'll focus on WVD for the sake of this demo today, but just know that the RDS deployment option is available. Next questions here have to do with the type of resources these users will get assigned. So first one here, are these users going to get assigned a dedicated personal desktop? The dedicated desktop is basically the same as a VDI in an RDS environment, right? It's a dedicated virtual machine where 100% of its resources will be allocated for the individual user assigned to it. So for this case, I'll say we have 3 users assigned dedicated desktops. It's pretty rare we see this assignment here. Generally, what we see is all users are assigned to a pool or a collection of pools just because it's more cost effective, but sometimes members of the executive team or maybe developers who need more resources at their disposal will request the dedicated desktops. The GPU pool desktop needs, I'll leave this blank, but just know you have the ability to ramp up resources and specify that here in the cost estimator. And so what we're going to do then is we will subtract these top 2 numbers from the total number and say, okay, we're going to assume that there will be a remainder of 22 users who will all be on a Windows Virtual Desktop pool, and that's what we're looking for. So then continuing on, we say, okay, please tell us a little bit more about these users. And what we're trying to do here is decide what resources you need in this environment to run the workload required for these users to operate successfully. So what we're going to say then is we're making an assumption that we can place 3 individual users on a single virtual machine core. And you can see the VM size we have here is an E4 SV3. So the assumption we're making is that we can place 3 users on a single core. And so that comes out to 12 users can get assigned to this individual virtual machine. So then it's going to multiply that out. If 12 users per core, and then you divide it by 22, that gives you your total number of virtual machines required to run this pool, and you'd see that listed here. So just scrolling down a little bit, I'll get into this in a little more detail in just a second, but just know that's the way this calculation is made. Okay, so what you could say is, professional workers, that's great, but we actually have power workers, for instance, right? So you'd select the drop down, specify power workers, and we're going to say, okay, we can now only put 1 user on a virtual machine core, which now means we need 6 session hosts to run this environment successfully, rather than the previous 2 required if we were placing 3 users on an individual core. So we're going to size based on the type of user you specify. It's always better to over allocate and come in with a little bit more margin rather than to under allocate here, but I'd say in most cases you're probably fine sticking with professional worker. You do have the ability to size it down to knowledge worker or task worker. The only thing to keep in mind there is these are very, very one-dimensional workers, right? This is an individual who logs into their desktop to access maybe a individual file or an individual application. They don't do anything else, right? Task workers are going to be pretty rare. Most of the time, I would recommend just price out professional workers, and you should be good to go. So now let's look at the server section. And with any new Nerdio deployment, we will provision these 3 primary servers. So the first one here, the domain controller, functions as a domain controller. It is also the source of AD Connect. We've got that installed there, and we run some of our scripts through the domain controller. So it's usually a pretty small VM size. Doesn't cost too much, but definitely critical. The second VM here is the file server, and it serves 2 functions. The first one is as a file server, and the second is the source of each user's virtual hard drives, and then some of their user-specific folders like desktop, documents, and favorites folders. And the file server is what FS Logics points to for the WVD orchestration piece. So those 2 servers, pretty critical for pretty much any environment. The last one here, the ADFS proxy, this is only required if you are doing internal management of your domain, you've got a federated domain. So if you don't have a federated domain, and again, that's fairly rare, you can go ahead and just reduce the drive size on this in the new environment, go ahead and power it off, and it becomes a rounding error at best. But our thought and our logic is it's better to have it and not need it than to not have it and need it. So that's why these 3 servers exist. For the sake of the deployment size here, I'll bump this FS server up to a D4 SV3. D2 might be fine, but just to run on the safe side, let's bump that up. And then because this server is the source of all the user's data, let's go ahead and move this to a P20. So you'd obviously customize this for your deployment, but just make sure that you've allocated enough space for the file server here. Continuing on, let's go ahead and add some additional servers. So let's say we've got a line of business server, and we'll put this as a D8 SV3. And let's give them just a P10, right? They don't need too much storage space here, but we'll give them premium SSD as well. We'll add another server. We'll call this, let's say, line of business server number 2. And then we'll allocate it similarly, right? Maybe they got 2 line of business servers, and for the sake of the demo, let's give them a Tiger Paw server, right? And as we're going through here, you can see as we're adding the various resources, the Azure price updates. So if I move this from a D8 to, let's say, a D4 SV3, you can see the price reduction. And the Nerdio pricing calculator plugs into the Azure pricing calculator via API integration. So these prices should be fairly up to date, and we say it's accurate within a 5% margin, give or take. So definitely a good resource, and some updated accurate pricing. So moving along, now let me go into a little more detail on this section right here. So like we talked about before, this is basically making an assumption based on the current user count and then what you've specified as the type of user. But let's say you said, okay, E4 SV3, that's a great VM size, but what if we bump this user count up to 100 users, right? If we scroll down, now we need 9 session hosts in this WVD pool, and that can be a little bit excessive. So, let's say we said, let's just increase the VM size. So instead of an E4 SV3, let's jump up to an E8, right? This provides more virtual machine core, and that means that we now only need 5 session hosts to run all the users in this environment. So, you can make that adjustment depending on the exact needs and the workflow. I'll keep this at 25 for now. Let's move that down to 3. And then the other thing is we have E4 SV3s specified as the VM size here. So, you might say, hey, E series is great. It's a little expensive, and we don't think the users are going to use all 32 gigs of memory here. So you could jump this down to like a D4 SV3, right? It gives about a 15% price reduction on each virtual machine compared to the E, and it has half of the memory. So if you've got users who probably won't need as much memory, you might get by just running on the D series. It's kind of up to you how you set this. Our typical recommendation is stay with the E series just for the sake of making sure that users have a good experience early on, and then you can always resize this after the fact. So again, overestimate a little bit just to make sure you build yourself in a little margin. This last section here is an assumption based on the standard work hours of users. So we say, okay, in a typical environment, we are going to have 40-hour work weeks. So our auto scaling, when we add this additional server, we're going to calculate based on what you specify here. So, let's say we're going to build a little bit of buffer, and this is going to be running 50 hours a week, right? You'll see the Azure price adjust here. So if we move this back down to 40, there we go, it reduces it. It's really not that much because you're only talking about 1 additional virtual machine on for an extra 10 hours because this one is always going to be on. However, you can build yourself a little buffer, maybe say, we'll run it 60 hours. And if you were to have 9 or 10 session hosts, obviously it would make a significant difference on the Azure price here. So let's drop this back down to 40. Perfect. So that basically covers the server section. So now let's get into licensing. And the licensing piece is honestly pretty straightforward. Microsoft has made it incredibly easy to license Windows Virtual Desktop, and the only thing you really have to keep in mind is that they require a Windows 10 Enterprise license. All right, so there's really a few ways you can go about this. The first one is if you just want to license the Windows 10 side of things, you would just select that here, and we'll do that for, let's say, 20 of the users. And this would really be applicable in situations where the client already has some type of Office license, maybe Office E3, and they don't want to move away from that. The other way of doing it is to provide it in a bundle license like M365 Business Premium, E3 or E5, and doing this provides the full Office, the P1 security, but then also the Windows 10 side of things. So 2 ways of doing it. The other option too is maybe the client already has the Windows 10 piece license, maybe through a bundle license or direct. You would just deselect both of these and it would remove it as a consideration from the quote. And from an overall pricing standpoint, it's really better, I guess it's cheaper rather, to do the Windows 10 a standalone license. I think this is $7 per user, and the M365 piece there is about $20 per user. So again, fairly straightforward. The only thing you really have to remember is any WVD user who plans to use a dedicated or a pool desktop requires the Windows 10 side of things. So with that, let's transition to the others features and we'll dig into the weeds a little bit. And this is probably one of my favorite sections of the pricing calculator. And the reason is because this section alone will make or break the solution from a pricing perspective. All right. Now, specifically what I'm talking about here are Azure hybrid benefits and reserved instance. If you apply this correctly and you utilize this correctly, it can equate to tens of thousands of dollars worth of Azure spend over a 3-year period. And, obviously the reverse side of that is you can lose a lot of money pricing out these environments if you don't understand these two pieces. The rest of this stuff we'll get into in a bit here, but the top two are really important to understand. So what I'll do is I'll give you a definition for each of these just in case you're not familiar with them. And then we'll jump over to the Azure pricing calculator and I'll show you a very practical example of why these pieces are so critical. So Azure hybrid benefits is basically you going to Microsoft and saying, hey, I'm going to purchase the operating system license for my virtual machines rather than renting it from Microsoft direct. All right, so what that would look like is up here we've got this line of business server. Let's say it's running on server 2016 OS. You're purchasing that, and let's say you do it for 3 years, right? So you'd say, I'm going to do a 3-year subscription, and that will cost you about, I think it's about $575, right? Pretty straightforward. Reserved instance, this is you telling Microsoft, hey, I know that I'm going to be running my virtual machines around the clock, but I'm going to tell you that I'll commit to running these around the clock for the next 3 years. So Microsoft likes it because they can predict the amount of CPU consumption, or compute consumption rather, that will get consumed in their data center. So they say, hey, for that predictability, we're going to give you some significant cost savings. All right. So reserved instance, again, is just you saying, hey, I'm committing to a certain amount of compute for a given period of time. In this case, we've selected 3 years. Azure hybrid benefits is you purchasing the OS rather than renting it from Microsoft. So let's jump over to the Azure pricing calculator here, and you can just Google Azure pricing calculator, should be one of the first options. We will select virtual machines, and then as we scroll down, here we go, specify your region, and then select the VM size. So I'll use the D8 SV3 in this case because it's what we priced out for both of those line of business servers. All right, so what we have here, we've set it to pay as you go, pretty standard, and then we have the license is included, which means we're going to be renting this license from Microsoft. Right off the bat, to run this on a month-to-month basis, this virtual machine is going to cost about $550. Now, you're probably looking at this saying, hey, that's a pretty expensive virtual machine. And I guarantee your clients would think the same thing, and I would agree with you. $550 for a single virtual machine. Remember, you might have 3 or 4 of these in a given pool, and you might have, several additional ones in an environment just because you've got the other servers running the different operating systems, or running the different applications rather, right? So now let's start applying some of these things like reserved instance, okay? So if I apply a 3-year reserved instance, cuts the monthly price down to $376. It's really good. That's better than $500. But if we apply Azure hybrid benefits, we take it a step further, right? This virtual machine is now reduced to $107.63 per month to run. Obviously, I don't have to tell you, this is a very significant cost savings, but let's actually scale this out. Let's see what this looks like, okay? So $550 is what it actually would cost renting everything. Subtract $100 and let's say $8. $442 every month is the cost savings on this. And when we scale it out to the 3 years, multiplying that by 36 months, $15,000 worth of cost savings is what we get to absorb and appreciate, all right? Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, is this is not considering the fact that we actually have to go out and buy the operating system from Microsoft, the OS license, because now we're not renting it from them. So let's include that as well. All right. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and clear this out. Okay. Let's say $108 times 36 months, which is 3 years. Okay. The operating system, purchasing that ahead of time, I think it's something near $575, right? So $4,463, let's say $4,500 is the 3-year cost for this. Okay, so now let's do another calculation just to show it in a little better light. So 550 times 36. Again, this is the price of running the virtual machine each month on the pay-as-you-go and not purchasing the OS. $19,000. Subtract this by, let's say, 4,500, and our price savings is 15,300. So renting everything, purchasing the operating system license, and this is including the license now, and using a 3-year pay-as-you-go commitment. And this is the price savings per virtual machine. So let's say you have 5 of these in an environment, right? So, 15,300, and then we multiply that by 5. You're talking $76,000 worth of cost savings for an individual client. So as you can see, very significant when it comes to the actual price of this environment. You can turn a very unfriendly looking environment from a price perspective into something that's very manageable and approachable. Now, you're probably asking yourself, okay, this is great, but what happens if the client leaves after 1.5 years or after 2 years, right? And that's definitely something to keep in mind. So from an Azure Hybrid Benefits perspective, you purchase the operating system. It's only about, $600, really not bad. And the amount you save, because if you look, if I said, hey, we're going to include the license, Microsoft's going to charge you $268 per month to rent this. So after your first 3 or 4 months, you've really captured all the cost savings. Everything beyond that is going to be just money in your pocket, right? So from a licensing perspective, there's really not much downside. From the reserved instance perspective, what Microsoft does is they say, hey, we have the option of charging you a 12% fee based on the remainder of what you owe. Okay, so what that looks like is, let's say we say, okay, we're going to do Azure Hybrid Benefits. We're going to go with the 3-year pay-as-you-go, and we're going to pay it all upfront, right? So they're going to charge you $3,800 for this virtual machine upfront. All right. What this looks like is, let's say it's been 1.5 years and the client says, hey, we're parting ways. So you would divide this in half, and then you pay 12% of that remaining number. So in reality, when it comes to what it would normally cost for this to run on full pay-as-you-go, and then you calculate in the savings, which is something like 62% here, it doesn't take long before this becomes a far more approachable solution and something that we highly recommend in every scenario. And one thing to keep in mind again is that 12% fee is optional. It's something that Microsoft can apply. However, they use their discretion in when they apply it. So we've had partners, not saying you should use this as a rule of thumb, but who go ahead and terminate the 3-year reserved instance, and they never get charged any penalties from Microsoft. So obviously assume you're going to get charged, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. So again, hopefully this provided a good example as to why you should always apply this. So we're going to go ahead and do that here, and we're going to say, yes, we want to apply the 3-year CSP. And you can just see, from an Azure perspective, $900. And if we say, nope, we're not going to do that, $1,700. This is a significant cost savings for this environment, all right? So what it's going to do is we're going to have a $2,000 upfront cost, because remember, we're purchasing all those licenses. So we've got 4 servers here, and it's roughly like $575 for the 3 years. So we've got an initial upfront cost of $2,300, and then after that, almost $1,000, $800 worth of cost savings. So good, some good cost savings you can capture, and you can pass this all on to the client, or you can build this into your margin, and you can capture some of that yourself. So moving on, we have 2 options. These next 2, in-region backup or out-of-region backup. This is basically just data residency for the actual backups. I'd say the vast majority, probably 9 times out of 10, we're going to go ahead and say just do in-region backup. That's going to be 3 instances of your backup within a specific region. Out-of-region DR basically means, hey, we're going to do the normal in-region backups. We're also going to place your backups in several different regions to allow for reduction in risk, maybe if a data center was to go down or there was something that affected a region. So typically we only see this feature here actually utilized effectively for maybe like a medical client or a law firm who has some type of legal restraint or legal requirement rather over their company and the way they run their business. And as a result, they need some data residency in different locations. So basically what we have here. Site-to-site VPN connection, pretty standard. I think it's like $30. So most cases we say, hey, go ahead and just factor this in. If you don't need it, obviously you can deselect this. Azure Hybrid Benefits, or Hybrid Active Directory rather. This right here is the process of you extending your current Active Directory into the Azure environment and running and using your internal domain as basically the authority there. You load up servers on the internal domain, load up pool templates, pools, session hosts, all those get created there, and you can kind of use your on-prem Active Directory as the authority. Now, it sounds a lot better than it is. I would say there are use cases for a hybrid Active Directory, but before you just go through here and apply it, probably reach out to us directly so we can have a conversation as to exactly what this includes. Because in most cases, what we find is it's actually easier to just do something like a greenfield deployment rather than trying to extend your current environment into the cloud. So I'll leave this as no for now, but this is an option for you. Desktop auto scaling, this is good if you've got a few of those dedicated desktops and you aren't going to do the reserved instance, then you can go ahead and apply this here. I think if we do, yep, here we go. So we can say, yeah, we're going to be desktop auto scaling, but if we're purchasing the compute beforehand, we can leave those on 24/7. Doesn't make a difference on the price. And then on-ramp regions, this is something that's pretty unique to Nerdio. Basically what this means is, let's say you have a client that's a large client, they've got 200 users and they have locations around the globe, right? Let's say a location in the US, location in Europe, and maybe a location in Japan. The actual deployment of this environment will get placed in the primary region, which for the sake of this demo is East US, all right? But users in Europe, users in Japan are now reaching halfway across the globe to actually access their resources, right? Their desktops, their pools, any servers, or anything like that. So what you can do is you can say, hey, we're going to place a node in another region around the globe, in this case in Europe and in Japan, and we're going to load the pools for these users in that location. So when they're working, they're going throughout their regular day-to-day tasks, they're working on resources in a local data center, and then when they have to maybe access a file from the file server, right? A virtual machine resource that was deployed in the primary region of this environment, then they reach across, they grab that file or whatever it is they're trying to access, and then they're back working on their local session, right? And this is again in a local data center. So this is definitely not going to be something you're going to use in every scenario, but it can be very effective for specific scenarios with larger clients where you're trying to make sure that latency and performance doesn't become an issue for their vast user base. So that basically covers the other features section. Now let's drop down to some cost assumptions here. And this section is honestly pretty straightforward. Bandwidth and storage are both ridiculously cheap in the Azure environment. Bandwidth specifically, that Microsoft and Azure only charges based on egress. So that means that download is free, upload actually costs money. So as you can see, you're talking $1.50, maybe $3 for graphic intensive users. But in general, making a slight under calculation or over calculation here is literally just a rounding error at best. It won't make a significant impact on your overall quote. The next section here, personal dedicated desktop VM size. This is for those dedicated desktops we set here at the top for those power users or executives or developers who require those. So, down here, I would say typically you're probably fine with a D2 SV3, sometimes maybe a D4. And then, if you had a user who maybe required the N series VM or something more powerful, you could specify that here. But typically, I'll keep this at a D2 because that tends to be just fine. 2 core, 8 gigs of memory, no type of credit limits like the B series have, and you should be set. These next 3 sections, they can make a pretty significant discount on the overall price, so I would definitely say keep an eye on these. However, if you are signed up through a distributor directly, they will tally these in for you, so you don't really need to worry about it. But Azure CSP discount, this is basically for the Azure spend, so this might be something like a 10% discount. CSP software discount, this would be for the actual licensing piece, so you might get like a 15% discount there, and then reserved instance. Typically, you don't get a discount for the RI, and the reason is because Microsoft has already made it so dirt cheap that it doesn't really make sense for them to discount it even further. So I think the most I've ever seen on that is a 1 or a 2% discount. So I'll go ahead and just leave this at 0. And then the final 2 things here are the Azure region, which in this case is East US, and then the currency, which I have set to US dollars. So we'll go ahead and select view cost here. Perfect. And now what we have is a great overview of the entire environment. So you can see everything broken up here. We've got the Azure cost, M365, the Windows 10 license piece, the Nerdio piece, Azure Hybrid Benefits. This is the section we're going to pay for up front because we're buying the OS license rather than renting it from Microsoft. And we saw the significant discount that translated here once we do this. So that's what this looks like. The overall environment, as you can see, it's only about $1,500 a month, really not too bad. Translates to $62 per user. And obviously this is going to scale and be more price effective the more users. So if you had 50 users in the environment, it's going to be a lot less, maybe like $45 a user or something like that. So definitely good to keep in mind. The other cool thing is after the deal has been won, you can actually provide this to the engineer deploying the environment, and they can build based on this. So they'll see the number of virtual machines. They will know, what type of reserved instance you have placed on these. Is Azure Hybrid Benefits been applied? What type of data has been allocated for it? They can make sure to match this so that you're sure you come in on the exact price point that you would quoted the opportunity for. And then continuing down, we just have some more Azure cost breakdowns, things like backups, the on-ramp region if we were going to apply those, individual desktop pricing, and then also the pooled desktops. We've got 2 here, and then the parameters we set, 40 hours per week. We got 1 at base, scaling up to 2. So this is basically just kind of an overview of everything that we set. Now, the next thing is, let's say you want to save this estimate and work on it later, right? So you would just select save here. And here we go, cost estimates. You can just do, let's say, cost estimate number 1. You can provide a description, go ahead and select save. And then this is now saved. So if you wanted to go back later, maybe review, or you were working on another estimate, you could select manage estimates here, and it will show your cost estimates 1, and you could provide details about the opportunity, and we can see when it was created, when it was modified, and some good additional information there. So fantastic. Well, that concludes this training video and tutorial. I appreciate you guys sticking with us till the end here. Have a good one.